So if you're watching this, you probably know about the whole MamaMax cult situation thing right now. I know that a lot of people who were trying to learn about this were frustrated when they were just told that the best way to learn more was to watch a 5-hour podcast on one of the victims' channels. So I figured for the sake of simplicity, I watched the entire podcast, took some notes, and I'm going to try to summarize it as best as possible so you can get the general gist of what's going on here, and then go to the podcast at specific timestamps if you need more in-depth details. So here we go. So basically the podcast is Max asking Spencer, who is the victim of a cult that's been going on for a long time and is still active, and he's interviewing her about what the cult is and her experience there. So at the 2-minute mark, Max asks the first question, which was, could you tell us more about yourself before you joined the cult? Spencer says she was raised by her grandparents, but she moved in with her dad and stepmom when she was 11, which was a couple years after her great-grandmother died when she was 9 years old. From here, she was thrown around to a bunch of other family members because she was going through some mental stuff and they didn't seem to understand it. Eventually, she moved back in with her dad and stepmom. And then that summer, she met a girl in summer school named Carrie Sutton, and they were both 16 years old at the time. So Spencer and Carrie became friends, and after the school year started, she started having more home issues. And at this point, Carrie introduced her to a guy she was talking to online who went by the name of Quinn. Quinn is 18 years old, just for context here. So Quinn, I guess, would try to manipulate them into doing things, and he even told Spencer that she was a vampire and that he was a werewolf and he could communicate with God, like all these outlandish kinds of things. So Spencer would communicate with Quinn on Kick, primarily. After they're talking for a while and they develop some sort of camaraderie, Quinn tells Spencer that she's in danger and he convinces her to come and live with him. So accommodations are made and she goes to live with Quinn in his mother's house. At the 7-minute mark, Max asks, tell me more about Quinn. So then that this Quinn guy, though just an alias, the real name of him was Camden, who you'll come to know as the leader of this cult. And so this was basically a supernatural kind of cult. They believed in things like vampires, werewolves, spirits. This guy basically said he could communicate with God, and at one point he said that he was God. So she goes into more details of the lore of the cult here. And then she also mentions that he would prey on underage people who had, ambiguous people about the supernatural. Those are the kind of people they're trying to pull into this kind of a thing. So at the 12-minute mark, Max asked how Camden would target people and how the whole operation was run. Spencer told him that he would go online and he'd make posts about the supernatural, and he was trying to specifically target people from 11 years old to 17 years old. And it got a lot of people involved. And the way that it was all set up was almost like an MLM, is what Spencer says, in the sense that there were rankings. So you could have, if you're an honorary member, you could be the leader of part of a pack, I suppose. And Spencer says that there could have easily been over 100 to 200 kids involved in this, at least at the peak. She also says that if someone of a higher up level were to leave, then Camden would make everyone delete all of their accounts and make new ones. She also says that if they refused to obey him, then he would tell them that they wouldn't be a vampire or whatever anymore, and sometimes he would threaten them with other stuff too. So there was one instance where members would leave and Camden would make a new account and pretend to be some sort of witch, and he would message them, and through this facade he'd get them to send him nudes, and then Camden, now back to being himself, he would use those pictures to blackmail them. There also seemed to be a financial component here. I know that he asked Spencer to sell her 3DS at one point to give him money, and when she refused, he threatened her, saying that her great-grandmother's soul would go to hell if she didn't do it, and he seemed to have a lot of other members also sending him money for stuff. There's definitely a financial component here too. At about the 21-minute mark, they talk about Quinn's or Camden's other aliases. So the other aliases that Camden would go by would be Quinn, Cade, and Sincade. And the last names that he used for all of these aliases was the Daemons, is what he called the last names for all of them. And Spencer says she knows his real name is Camden because when she was staying with him, she saw his ID. At about the 28-minute mark, they talk about the other platforms the cult was active on. Spencer says that the cult was most active on Kick and Whisper, and Camden was at the top of the cults, and I guess whoever he was dating at the time would be a co-leader. And there were these weird familial structures with it, where I guess Camden and his girlfriend would be the mom and dad, and the rest would be the children of the whole thing. And also Camden apparently would have people spy on their group chats, so he would always know what was going on. At about the 33-minute mark, they asked How did your experience differ from what you first expected when you joined? And Spencer says that when she met Camden for the first time, he immediately initiated sex with her. She felt uncomfortable, but she did comply. And she also mentioned that Camden was oftentimes very sexual. So at the 34-minute mark, they talk about something that happened to Spencer when she was actually on her way to moving in with Camden. So she had to travel a lot. It took days for her to get to him, and in the process of reaching him, when she was in Arkansas, she was apparently sexually assaulted, and unfortunately, because of this, she actually became pregnant from that sexual assault. So when she finally met Camden and told him about this, he forced her to induce a miscarriage by feeding her a large amount of cinnamon, vitamin C, and beating her stomach. And then Camden himself actually got her pregnant on 3 other occasions and then repeated this induced miscarriage process. He told her the reason he did this was because he wanted to traffic her and he thought that this process would get her body to automatically start rejecting pregnancies. And I guess there were points where he would try to get her to sleep with other men off of Whisper, and she refused to do that because she just didn't want to. And he told her that Leviathans were coming after her and that she needed to leave immediately after that. I guess he was upset that she wouldn't do it. So after this whole scenario happens, she is rushed down to a gazebo in his neighborhood, and Camden tells her to call 911 with the phone that he gave her. The police arrive. Camden walks up and acts like he doesn't know what's happening, acts like, he just felt bad for this girl, didn't know who she was. And I guess the idea behind this was to force Spencer into a foster home or group home, essentially separating her from being like this close to him. At about 38 minutes and 20 seconds, Max asks more about Camden, and Spencer tells us that he would physically and assault her. One time he tried to kill her on one occasion. At 41 minutes and 37 seconds, Max asks, describe day-to-day life in the cult. Spencer says that when she lived with him every day, things were more health focused. He would feed her, give her water, encourage her to exercise, but sometimes he wouldn't let her shower for days because this kid lived with his mom and his brother, so I guess he didn't want them knowing that he had this girl over there. And sometimes Spencer, she would have to pee in jars because he wouldn't let her leave the room. And then there were even some occasions in which he wouldn't even feed her. She recalls one experience where she went, like, days had gone by, and for days he was only feeding her saltines and water. And of course, she mentions a lot of sexual assault that was happening in day-to-day life. That was a very big factor of all of this. At the 52-minute mark, something interesting happens. Spencer mentions another member of this cult who is named Kayla, who was sexually assaulted by Camden. And I guess she reported him to the police, and for some reason nothing happened. They just didn't care, I guess. So Spencer and her friend decided they wanted to stick around and try to collect evidence to try to do something about this. And this is when they started to really see how bad Camden was. So at 1 hour, 1 minute, and 30 seconds, Max asks, was there a moment that led you to want to escape? Spencer says that the sexual assault of Kayla played a big factor in that, and she said it was December of 2017 when she actually found out that this happened, and she was actually the one that made Kayla call the police. So the police were given photo evidence, texts, and they didn't do anything. And and then I guess eventually Spencer ended up leaving for good on the 4th of July. At 1 hour, 5 minutes, and 45 seconds, Max asks Spencer what the process of leaving was like, and she said that basically she just told Camden that she was going to go, and that was that, but she is still dealing with heavy trauma to this day. I mean, that kind of trauma doesn't really go away. So that first hour was really the heaviest part, where they talked most about like what the cult was, how it operated, like that kind of information. And then the remaining 3.5 hours kind of goes a different direction. So I'm not going to go too in depth with that because it goes more into Spencer's experience, how she recovered from the trauma, all those kinds of things. And I don't want to really compress someone's life experience down like that. So I'm just going to go over this part quickly. So from where we left off, which is about an hour and 5 minutes, to the 2-hour mark of the podcast, it was more like a recap of what we heard so far to get the timeline straight. They talked about Spencer's experiences in foster care and group homes and her experience with her life after she left the cult. From the 2-hour to 3-hour mark, they talked about how this affected her religious beliefs, the psychology behind cults, and tips on how to recover from this kind of trauma. And from the 3 hour mark to the 4 hour mark, they talked about things like educating children on the dangers of stuff like this, censorship that gets in the way of, trying to get word out about this kind of stuff, the failures of law enforcement. And then the interview actually officially ends at 3 hours and 36 minutes. And from this point, it cuts to a different segment where Spencer is reading out testimonies from other victims. So I'm not going to read those out or go too in depth there, but here are timestamps of these people if you want to go and watch that for yourself. So at the 3 hour, 36 minutes, and 15 seconds section, they read the testimony of survivor A, who was 13 years old. At 3 hours, 50 minutes, and 20 seconds, they read the testimony of survivor B, who is also 13. And then at 3 hours, 54 minutes, and 55 seconds, they talk about the testimony of survivor C, who was 18 years old at the time, but they say they had a learning disability that they describe as having their mind stuck at 13 years old. And that was basically the entire podcast. So hopefully this is like if anyone wants to know what's going on and doesn't want to watch the whole thing, hopefully you get a general idea of what's going on. And if you want more in-depth details, you can just go to the areas I timestamped. So yeah, that's that.